If you're interested in what I look like in real life and want to learn more about me, then follow my Instagram page at Joe the Insomniac. I'm a search and rescue officer for the US Forest Service, and I have some stories to share. Now, I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as a motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called in on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to the search area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when asking where her brother was, she told us that he had been taken by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet. He wanted to play with her brother for a while. That last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the quote bear man, seeming calm. Of course, our first thought is of abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but tall and covered in hair like a bear, with a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It's one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mum and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they called for help. Again, we search everywhere and never find a trace of her. I have no idea where she could have possibly gone, because neither her mother or grandpa saw her come down. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me up straight cliffs. No hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's often baffling, and in those cases, we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff. Or sometimes, miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's also strange. On one particularly sad case, it involved the recovery of a body. It was a young girl who fell down an embankment, getting stuck at the base of a tree in a complete freak accident. I'll never forget the sound her mother made when I told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded to the ambulance and let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. This is the hardest part of the job, I think. It's just terrible. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we had received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days. Obviously his leg had turned septic. We were able to get him into a helicopter, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely out of it, but he kept on talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he got into the top, a man had been there, a guy with no climbing equipment, wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face, literally a blank void where his face should have been. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he's fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down and letting out horrible muffled screams as he comes down the mountain. This is one of the stories that bothered the life out of me, and I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I have ever happened to be involved with is the search of a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotten log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk back to our base. Along the way, she kept on looking behind us and asking, "Why is that big man with black eyes following us?" We couldn't see anyone, so wrote it off as some kind of symptom of shock. But the closer we got to the base, the more agitated the woman got. She kept asking me to make him stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and began yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him. She said she would not give him to us. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't know how to describe it, but we're within sight of base ops. The woman trusted me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could possibly open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." Now, I had a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it was mostly hidden under my collar. The woman couldn't have seen it. Right after she says it, I heard that weird coughing right in my ear, and I jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show her how freaked out I was. But God, I have to say, I was really happy to leave the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of unspoken as a regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to speak about it, but it's just so weird. Now, this usually happens when we're really far into the wilderness, like 30 or 40 miles, and at some point, we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. Just like if you took the staircase in your house and cut them out, putting them into the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw one, and the officer just told me, "Don't worry about it, it's normal." Everyone I've spoken to said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them, and just ignore them when I run into them because it happens so frequently. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls, people who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, getting injured by fire. I mean, you wouldn't believe how often this happens. Usually drunk kids getting bitten or stung by animals and insects even. We're a tight team though, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of people. That's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently he has a history of seizures, and she's worried that he's forgotten to take his medication and had one while on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing because past a certain point, it doesn't matter. Someone's missing, and it's my job to find them. So we went out on a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found a sign of the guy who had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan-like formation, covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes over the radio telling us to head back to the vet's location. So we come right away, because this usually means that the missing person is injured and we'll need a full team to help them get out safely. We met up, and the vet is just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the sides of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on. He then points up to the branches of the tree. I almost could not believe what I was seeing. There's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around a branch. It's hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's still in the area. We're worried now. We call up into the tree. It's obvious no one's there. We all sort of leave scratching our heads. We keep on searching for the guy but never find him. We even bring our canines out, but they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is called off because there are other calls we have to attend, and past a certain point, there's nothing we can do. The guy's wife actually called in every day for months on end, asking if we found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless with every call. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it's just the sheer improbability of it, that, and the questions raised. How the hell did the guy's cane end up there? Did someone kill him and throw it up as some weird trophy? God knows. But we did our best to find him, and that was almost like a taunt. We even talk about him amongst each other from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking, no matter what the circumstances at which they go missing under. It's never easy, and we always dread the ones where we find deceased children. It's not common, but it does happen. Now, some people talk a lot about kids' SAR teams finding them in places they shouldn't or couldn't be. I can honestly say that I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it. But I'll share one story that I witnessed personally. A mother and 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, the other about 3. Now she's watching them really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs their stuff up and they start to head back to the parking area. Now this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods. It's on a very clearly established trail. Now it's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking lot area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path, like on purpose. Her kids were walking in front of her when she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in 4 or so seconds she's not looking. Her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figures he's stepped off the trail to pee or something, and goes to the other 2 to ask where he is. They then both tell her that a big scary man with a scary face come out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids didn't seem upset in the fact that it later seems as though they've been drugged up. They're sort of spacey and fuzzy, so of course she freaks out, starts looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name and says at one point she thinks she heard him answer. Now obviously she can't blindly run into the woods since she's got the other 2, so she calls the police and they sent out us immediately. We respond and we start searching for him. Over the course of the search and span of miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up any scent. We don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being over there. Of course, there's suspicion about that for a while, that maybe the mother had something to do with it, but it's clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We look for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help, but eventually the search peters out and we have to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body needs to be recovered. Now, they tell us the location and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid, but we go out there about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the right person. I've been trying to figure out how the kid got there ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in some places no one else would think, on the off chances a body's been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars and sure enough, there's a body of a young boy, stuffed into a little opening in the rock, and he immediately recognizes the colour of the kid's shirt and knows right away that's him. That's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. We took almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we're seeing. Not only is he 15 miles away from where he'd started, there's no possible way he could have got there on his own. The slope is terrible. It's even hard for us with climbing gear. A 5-year-old has no way of getting up there. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet are fine. So it wasn't an animal that's taken him up there. Now he'd been out there for over a month by this point, and it looks like he's only passed away in the last couple of days. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that he passed away from exposure, but there's no suspects and no answers to date. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search OP for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mum. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs are on a strong scent trail, and we saw clear signs that he's in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he's last been seen. The kid wasn't even aware that he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for, because I'm not really good with kids, and I find it hard to talk to them or keep them company. As my trainer and I are heading back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hotspots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. Now as we're walking around, she points out the area where she's found people in the past, and I see something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles away from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on state protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire towel or makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with buildings in. But I can see from here that whatever it is has straight edges. And if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, but she doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over and check it out. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all the hairs on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase in the middle of the woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with a beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, this is out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously. I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load completely and only the stairs are visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try and make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, just casually, looking at it as though it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her, "What the hell's that thing?" She chuckles and says, "Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them." I start to move closer, but she grabs my arm and says, "I wouldn't do that." Her voice is casual, but grip is tight. She says you're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them or touch them. Just ignore them. I start to ask her about it, but she tells me it's best if I don't. So we end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right though. Roughly every 5th call I go on, I end up running into a set of stairs. Sometimes they're close to the path, maybe 2 or 3 miles away. Others they're 30 or 40 miles away, but literally in the middle of nowhere. I only find them during broadest searches or training weeks. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks as though it's been out there for ages. They come in different sizes. The biggest I ever saw was like it was one from in a mansion. It's at least 15 or 20 feet high. Very strange. I asked some of my other colleagues and they just say don't worry, they're not a big deal, just don't go up to them. When my trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't have any answer for it, it's just weird. This is another one that is less spoken about and even more sad. A young man went missing in late winter, when realistically no one should be that far out onto the trails. Now we close a lot of trails, but some remain open year round unless there's a ton of snow. We did an OP for him, but we have had about 6 feet of snow on the ground, and we knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until spring came. Now sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little way off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree, in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scares the life out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any time in the mountain will probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees because they have a sort of umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the tree that's usually filled up with loose, powdery snow and branches. They're called tree wells, but they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. So we put up signs in the welcome centre, big ones. People don't know how dangerous they are, but every year that we get unusual amounts of snow, at least one person doesn't read the sign or take the warning seriously. We find out about it in spring, but my guess is that the young man was hiking, got tired, or maybe had a cramp from walking and went to the base of the tree, not knowing there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck up with his feet up. The surrounding snow caved in around him, and he would have suffocated. It's called snow immersion, suffocation, and doesn't usually happen except for places with very deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, 6 feet of snow can get on top of you. What scared me most was imagining how he must have struggled upside down in the freezing cold, and you wouldn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense heavy pile on top of him, making it impossible to get out and harder to breathe. He would have known what was happening, and God, I can't imagine what that would have been like. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the goat man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess I have. Now, I've never had anything quite like the whole black-eyed man thing. However, there was one call where I saw something similar, but I'm not sure if I'm willing to chalk it up to the goat man. We got in a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting down to the main area. We hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside her. He runs, well, I guess more of jogs to us, and tells us that he's a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife suddenly starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her, and she's passed out on the trail. We then manage to get her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the welcome centre, She comes to and starts screaming again. I ask her to calm down on what's happened. I can't remember exactly what she said, but it's something along the lines of this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she starts hearing a really strange sound, sounding sort of like a cat, but something's off. She couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try and hear it better, and it sounded as though it's coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she is, until she finally figured out what's wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird. I couldn't forget it. She said, "It wasn't a cat, it's a man," just saying the word meow over and over again. But it's not a man, it couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make a voice like this before. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded all buzzy. It's awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I was. And the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's how I fainted. Now obviously, I am very perplexed by this, and confused to hear this. How could a guy be coming out of the woods trying to meow at someone? So once we get down the mountain, I tell my superior that I'm gonna search the area and see if I can find anything. He then gives me the go ahead. I grab a radio and hike to where she fainted. Now I don't see anyone, so I keep going about a mile or so. When I head back, I decided to go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset by this point. I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to check it again tomorrow. But as I'm heading back, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop and I call out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. Now the sound doesn't get closer or become any louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow, meow, in this really odd monotone voice. As comical as it sounds, it's almost like the guy in South Park with the Electrolax, Ned. So I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get any closer. It's almost as though it's coming from all directions. Eventually, it kind of fades out and end up going back to the welcoming center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to the area, I've never heard the exact same sound again. To this day, I have no idea what it was. I honestly don't know how I'd forgotten this, but this is the scariest thing that happened to me. I guess I've tried for so long to forget all about it, but it doesn't go away. Now as someone who spends literally all day on their own time in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone or out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experiences like this, you tend to just forget about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me really seriously consider if this job is the right one for me. I don't like talking about it, but I'm going to do the best I can. I recall this took place the end of spring. It's a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl has wandered away from her family's campsite and been missing for 2 hours. Her parents are completely despondent and told us what most parents do. My kid would never wander away. She's good at staying close and never done anything like this before. We assure the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her, and spread out in a standard search formation. Now I'm partnered with one of my good buddies, and we're sort of casually holding conversation while we hike. I know it sounds boring, but you kind of become desensitized when you've done this for long enough, and just talking's helping us. It becomes the norm. I think to a certain extent, you have to learn to become desensitized. We search for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where we think she should be, and we come out of a small valley when something makes us both stop in unison. We freeze and look at each other, and there's almost a sensation like a plane depressurizing. My ears pop. I have this odd sensation of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt it, but before I can, I hear the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life. Almost like a freight train passing directly by, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above us. He screams something to me, but I can't hear him. We look around trying to find the source, but neither of us can see anything. Of course my first thought is it's a landslide, but we're not near any cliffs. Even if we were, it would have hit us by now. The sound goes on, and we're trying to yell at each other, but even standing close together we can't hear anything but the sound. Then, suddenly as it starts, it stops. It was like somebody threw a switch and cut it off. We stand there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly the sounds of the woods come back. He says to me what's happened, but I shrug. We stand there, looking around for a minute. I get on the radio to see who else has heard that, but no one has. Even though we're within shouting distance of each other, my buddy and I shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we check up on the radios and no one's found her. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark because we don't have any kind of lead on her. A few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep close together. We're calling out for her every couple of minutes. By now, I'm hoping beyond belief that we find her. The idea of them being out on their own is awful. The woods can be an intimidating place in the daylight, but at night, it's a whole different beast. But we're not seeing any signs of her or getting any responses. And around midnight, we decide to turn around and head back to our rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops, shining his light off to the right of us, into a really thick deadfall, or group of dead trees. I ask him if he's heard a response, but he just tells me to keep quiet and listen. I do, and in the distance, I can hear what sounds like a kid crying. We both stop and listen, but only get this faint crying back. We head in all directions of this deadfall and go around it, calling her name over and over. As we get closer to the crying, I start getting this weird feeling in my gut. I tell my buddy that something's not right. He tells me he feels the same way, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we are and call the girl's name out again. And at the same time, we both figure it out. It's a crying loop. It's the same little hitching sob, then wail, then hiccup, repeated over and over. It's exactly the same every time, and without saying another word, we both take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost composure like that, but something was so incredibly wrong. And neither of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous, we asked if anyone else heard it, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know it sounds sort of anticlimactic, but that's the most messed up thing I've ever heard out on the job before.